Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Doctor Who Guide. I'm your host, Alex Patterson, and today I am very excited to be joined by a special guest, Anthony Garnon. You are an incredible Doctor Who fan who has just connection to Doctor Who in so many different ways, a special connection to the world of Doctor Who merchandise. The reason I wanted to have you on is because you were instrumental in connecting me with Terraqueous Distributors and the 1997 annual. You introduced me to the editor, Mark, and got me the opportunity to write for the 1997 annual, for which I am forever grateful. And I am so grateful to Mark as well for, believing in me and my pitch. But if you could just tell us how you first got into Doctor Who.
So I was born in 89. The show was just about to go off air months after I was born. So I grew up with the videos. I've said to you before when we talked the Doctor Who 60th range, that the first story, one of my first memories in life was watching Megapolis. So I grew up in the wilderness years when there was not really an awful lot of new Doctor Who. I wasn't familiar with things like Doctor Who magazine until later in the 90s. So really for me, the first big event in Doctor Who was the Paul McGann TV movie. And I remember suddenly I could update my Doctor chart that I wrote out every day with every Doctor and every year that they appeared in the show. I could finally update it and put Paul McGann 1996 to ... So that had a big impact on me. And then after the TV movie, that's when I discovered the magazines a little bit more. So suddenly I was, buying the magazine. My dad was buying the videos, and bit by bit, I was filling in the blanks because it's a little bit odd now because there was a time when actually you couldn't access various stories of Doctor Who. You'd have to wait for them either to broadcast on satellite television, which we didn't have. Or you'd have to wait for the VHS release to come out. So something like Meglos was a mythical story for me because I couldn't actually see Meglos until the very early 2000s. So whenever I do my marathons, every marathon would slowly get longer and longer because the more stories we had, the longer it would take. And two, it was nice to fill in those gaps, companion exits. We were generally quite well served in terms of Doctor regenerations. They pretty much were all available. And then I'd love to say Big Finish come along, and I'm a Big Finish fan from day one. My family were not that wealthy, and so we didn't have a lot of disposable income. So for a long time, I'd read Doctor Who magazine in envy when you'd see things like the Who Shop or other adverts in the magazine saying buy this Big Finish adventure or buy some of the spin-offs. The Stranger series, for example. So really, for me, I wasn't immersed in Doctor Who merchandise for a long time. Then the new series comes along, and I'm 16, 17. Get my first job. I can suddenly go into Woolworths and supermarkets, and Doctor Who toys are everywhere. So for a long time, I had every character collectible you could possibly imagine, with the exception of Cassandra out of the frame. I don't know if it's a very notorious character,
Yes.
character type. And then I suppose from that I moved to London, and then one thing led to another, and eventually I started working at Forbidden Planet, and I landed the licensing job there. So one of the licenses that I worked on was Doctor Who. So that was a great opportunity to come in and decide what we'd like to see on the market. And weirdly, not being able to buy stuff when I was younger probably benefited because I understood what I viewed as all of the essential items, because I understood, well, actually, if a kid only has, X amount of pocket money, what is it that is essential for that kid? Is a kid going to want a Dalek enamel pin badge first, or are they going to want to buy a Sil pin badge? And so you're able to prioritize. And this goes kind of hand in hand, not from a merchandise point of view, but Torchwood and Sarah Jane were both on British television in the late 2000s. And I used to run two blogs that were about the development of those series. so Torchwood TV and Sarah Jane TV. And I think I can say, I think I can now unveil who was giving me the spoilers. But we had a couple of interesting names who would email and give us various pieces of plot information. So a certain Mr. Barrowman would email and say, Jack's immortal. You find out at the end of episode 1, the Cybermen are back in episode 4. What can they do now? I mean,
you had insider information.
Yeah, and then so that was fun because there wasn't an awful lot of coverage of Torchwood pre-airing of season 1. And then Sarah Jane had even less. So I think Sarah Jane, as a CBBC series, was kind of just viewed as a weird, insignificant satellite thing. But I loved Sarah Jane, one of my favorite characters in the show. So I never viewed it as insignificant. I always thought this is just as important as Torchwood and Doctor Who. So I ran those for a while, and via running those, you'd get messages from various people. It's one of the, I'm going to be very careful with this, but somebody associated to somebody on the cast of the Sarah Jane Adventures, let's put it that way, they would frequently update me with various bits of gossip from the Sarah Jane Adventures. So whether this is common knowledge or not, I don't know. But the character of Kelsey in the pilot episode was supposed to be a regular. So it was supposed to be Kelsey, not Clive, in the Sarah Jane Adventures. And the filming of the pilot episode, Invasion of the Bane, there was some behind the scenes drama. But that wasn't picked up by anybody because nobody was paying attention to the Sarah Jane Adventures. So we got an odd scoop that we got to announce that there would be a new character. Unfortunate for the actress that played Kelsey, but there would be a new character in Clive coming into the series. And then when you start posting things like that haven't been run by the BBC, you start to get emails back from the BBC saying, how do you know Captain Jack is immortal? How do you know the Cybermen? How do you know this actress has been let go from the series? And officially, she wasn't let go. It was always supposed to be that she was in that one story. But my understanding at the time was it was intended she would continue with Luke and Maria. So suddenly you got the BBC messaging saying, what's going on? How do you know all of this stuff? And I suppose just to tie it all together, the third element of Doctor Who is that, since I was so young, I would write various stories with regards to the Seventh Doctor when I was very young. And then once the Eighth Doctor came around, I'd started to write Eighth Doctor stories, which, if you ever read them, they're so violent. I think once it became clear that Paul McGann wasn't going to have a series, and I got it in my head, I think every other story the Doctor regenerated. So for increasingly horrific reasons. So you'd have a story that the TARDIS console exploded and it caused a fire and he burned to death. And then you'd have Doctor 14 or Doctor whatever it got to.
Oh my gosh.
One of the things after the Paul McGann movie came out was the Radio Times in the UK had a sci-fi section, and the very bottom bit of that weekly article was a really short comic strip by Gary Russell and Lee Sullivan that continued the story on from the end of the TV movie, and featured a couple of new companions, especially for this particular comic strip. I really liked them. I would pick them up weekly. I said my family weren't very rich, so what we'd do is we'd just sneak into the supermarket. I'd read the 6 panels, whatever it was, on the story, and then it'd go back on the shelf. But I had it in my mind. I didn't own the physical copies, but I had distinct memories of various storylines. So flash forward a couple of years, things have moved on, and there's no Paul McGann movie. But I'm writing the continuing adventures of this Eighth Doctor and his two companions from this comic strip. So Mark from Terraculus is hopefully I'm saying that right. To this day, I have no idea how you say it properly.
That's how I say it.
He is a really, really, really nice guy that is very open to new faces, open to new ideas. So a while back, I'd got involved in one of the Colin Baker annuals, which led on to me doing other annuals as well. All of these books, they're always faux to the era that they're set in. So if they do an 80s book, it always resembles what the book would have looked like in 1986 if it had been published. There's various rules that go along with that. To make it era appropriate, you can't do certain things. You couldn't introduce the Slovene into the 1986 annual. I mean, aside from the copyright implications, you couldn't do something before it was supposed to happen. And the 1980s annuals, 70s and 60s, they were generally written by one generation of writer all the way through. I started to think that actually one of the things that would have been different about a 1990s annual, if you consider this is the era of things like the X-Files, the Simpsons, Buffy, Babylon 5, etc. And journalism had moved on, and it's weird because a kind of a second or third generation of sci-fi writer began to emerge. So yes, people like Russell T Davies or Stephen Moffat, Mark Gatiss, yes, them, but also people like Gareth Roberts, Jonathan Bloom, Paul Cannell, Kate Orman. A new generation started to come through, and so it hit me that actually, if the annuals had carried on, if we act under the pretense that the annuals never stopped from annual one in 65 all the way through, that actually what you probably would have got by the 1990s is the generation that wrote those annuals probably would have retired off, and a new generation who were writing things like Dreamwatch magazine, SFX magazine, the Doctor Who magazine of the 90s, they would have come to the forefront, and they would have been writing those stories instead of the old guard. And as part of that, you start to think, well, we can't get those people. Can you imagine going to Russell T Davies and saying, can you pretend that you're writing a story from 1996? We can't pay you, it's not for profit. Can you please have a story for this book? Obviously, you can't do that. So what you have to do is look at what would be the modern day equivalent of that generation. And coincidentally, enough time has gone by that actually the next generation is now beginning to emerge. So people like yourself, Philip Hawkins, that new generation, I think you now are what the writers of the 1990s Doctor Who Expanded Universe were at that time, obviously without having YouTube and internet necessarily. So I thought it was worthwhile just to explore the possibility of having that kind of new generation that's emerging now, but let's pretend that they were the generation emerging in the 1990s. And I mean, let's be honest. I mean, everybody who's watching this or is watching any of the other channels, let's be honest. We all know how creative these videos are, and all of the dedication that goes into them, whether it's through editing or whether it's through doing things like this. Lots of time and energy spent, and that's an important component in writing. Now, obviously, there has to be a story. There has to be some sort of point to what's going on. You couldn't just turn around to anybody and say, fill 10 pages of the story. And that's where, if you remember, at the very beginning, I would pitch ideas to you and say, well, look, I've been in contact with Mark, work with him on some ideas. Here's some I've had for you. And I would ping some back and forth. And I'm loath to tell people what the idea is, because I'm sure this will happen one day with you. But I pinged an idea that was very specific to your viewpoint of Doctor Who fandom. Let's put it that way, without giving the game away too much.
Yep.
That was also appropriate for 1996 because you had that passion for this particular topic. And anybody who's looking behind you right now might have a very small clue as to what we might be talking about. I knew that would be a good springboard for you because you could think that, and then you could either use that idea or you could kind of run away and come up with your own. The really nice thing for the 1997 annual was once we'd had that discussion, and then obviously you started working very closely with Mark and the artists. I actually don't know what the final version of your story, reads like, looks like with the illustrations. So I think I'm more excited to see your story than I necessarily am to see my own, because by this point I'm sick of reading the script for mine or looking at the final product, because I've seen it so often. And so I think that's the really nice thing from my side, is to kind of see your story in its final fully fledged form.
Well, thank you. I mean, I'm just so excited. It's going to be a surreal experience seeing it in print with the beautiful illustrations that Chris has done. Oh my gosh, just so exciting, and to see it in the context of everybody else's stories. I don't know that I was aware that you had a story in the 97 annual. That is
Yeah,
really exciting.
So I have a story that that I have wanted to tell with Doctor Who. I hate to be one of these people. I can't say anything about it because the whole point of the story is the last page. And there are very clever Doctor Who fans. And if I say what the story is called, there is a very big clue as to that last page. It's a historical, I will put it that way. So I have that. And then unusually, I don't often do this, but there's some nonfiction by me as well. So I said I was a big fan of those comic strips in the Radio Times magazine. I think it's a really overlooked portion of Doctor Who Expanded Media, because it's never been reprinted in any form, because the Radio Times own all the rights to these comics, and they don't have a license to produce Doctor Who graphic novels or whatever they'd have to classify as. No one's ever really talked about that specific run of, I think it's 42 issues. Really small amount of content, because it's 6 panels to each installment. There were 10 installments to each story, and the final story was just 2 installments. So there isn't a lot of content. It's a really minute amount. I think it amounts to something like, I think it's something ridiculous, like 26, 27 pages of story if you actually put it all together. So nobody had interviewed Gary Russell or Lee Sullivan about this specific time on Doctor Who. So again, working with the editor Mark, I pitched the idea that we go to Lee, we go to Gary. I'm fortunate that I know Lee through Forbidden Planet. I used to run book signings. He was very successful on a comic adaptation of Rivers of London. So he'd come in quite a lot and he'd do signings for that. So I had that background with Lee. So I asked Lee, and then Lee put me in touch with Gary, Alita, who did the lettering for the comic. We tried to get in touch with Alan Craddock, who did the colouring. Unfortunately, I'd never got a response of Alan, so he's the missing piece of this particular puzzle. But this non-fiction article looks back on all 40 issues, all 42 issues of this story, and goes into a bit of detail as to why it wrapped up as quickly as it did, hints at some of the storylines that would have come if the comic hadn't have been curtailed when it was, which I don't think that Gary has ever really discussed before. If memory serves, I think that we actually get an episode title that we didn't know prior to this article. So I was really happy that Mark saw that as an opportunity. I said to Mark, if this was an actual annual in 1997, at that time, the Radio Times was owned by the BBC, and also the BBC novels. They were the only 2 official BBC-owned iterations of Doctor Who. So an annual in 1997 would either have featured Samantha Jones from the books or Stacey and Sard from the Radio Times comic strip. Sam got 3 years of stories in the novels, and we got an exit from her. Stacey and Sard had a truncated, run of comic strips. So it made sense to say, well, actually, wouldn't it be quite fun to have Stacey and Sard as the 2 companions, especially because you can also make some Ice Warrior jokes. So that was quite fun. So I have those 2 in it. I'm really proud of the text article, just because it's a new, and this, it's an unusual to find an area of Doctor Who that hasn't been covered by somebody else. It's a very slight. I think it's 3 or 4 pages long. It's it's not it's not the longest article in the world, but it's nice to kind of honor that little piece of my childhood.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So thank you to Mark. There we are for
Yes.
allowing us to do the Eighth Doctor and allowing both of us to feature within it. Just as a big fan of that Doctor, it was, it's quite nice to finally tick off and say I've done an unofficial Eighth Doctor story.
I mean, what a privilege. I'm so excited to read that article. I just feel so lucky and so honored to be able to have written for them, and with that kind permission from, Gary Russell, and then to be given this chance through Terraqueous. I'm just so excited, and I cannot wait for, everybody to now, at the time that people watch this, you'll be able to get the annual and to read it and see people's reactions. I can't wait to read your story and get to that last page, see what that title is. After this interview, I'll be hounding you for the title. I'll see if I can get it out of you.
I'll see if you can work it out.
I wanted to include you in this because, you were an important part in introducing me to Mark and getting me into the annual. And so I'm just so grateful for that opportunity and for all that you've done for the Doctor Who world of merchandising and for the annual itself. It's been really wonderful. And I appreciate the time that you've given me. We're going to have to end this here, even though I feel like I could talk for 3 hours with you. But I have to go now. But I really appreciate your time and all that you've shared. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. I suppose the last thing for me really is just to say, I facilitated putting you in touch with Mark, but everybody who Mark used, it's your talent, and your talent alone is what made him decide to run with your stories. So just to spin that back round, well done on yourself, and congratulations for being in the book.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks so much for joining me.